take just a moment just to breathe. I'm not demanding that you breathe. You don't have to, but I highly recommend it. As you breathe, imagine that you're filling yourself from bottom to top. Feel your stomach stretching with your breath and the breath moving up into your chest. As you breathe, maybe you can picture that as you exhale, all of the stresses and the frustrations of life are going out with that breath. And you want to get that stuff all gone, so exhale as deeply as you can. When you think you have all your breath out, just try and squeeze just a little bit more out. As you inhale, imagine that you are breathing in God's breath. The breath that we are told stirred creation into being. The breath that animated the dried bones. And this is the good stuff. So as you breathe in as deeply as you can. Feel your muscles stretch, your rib cage stretch. If you're like me, this deep, intentional breathing calms me down. It gives me a moment of peace, a moment of sanctuary, no matter where I am. It's a time just to be and to remind myself that as long as I breathe, that there is potential. I wonder, as Jesus was approaching the gates of Jerusalem, if he took some time just to breathe. Maybe he gathered his followers in around him and told them, okay, this is what's going to happen, but first, let's all just breathe. Maybe this is what Jesus did while he was waiting for a couple of his friends to go and gather the donkeys that he would soon be riding. Maybe this is what he did to calm his own soul, because he was about to make some steps that were sure to bring some trouble. For Jesus, breathing was not only an act of self-calm and self-care, but it was also an act of resistance, because there were a lot of people at that time that really wished he would stop breathing. He was causing trouble, and the wrong kind of trouble with the wrong kind of people. There were so many that were being upset by the messages that Jesus was bringing, that justice belongs to all people, that all people are loved by God. People were upset by the call to justice, where all people are empowered, where humility is where real strength lies, where being a leader means being a servant. To so many, that seemed like nonsense. Being a leader means being able to squash anybody else that got in your way. Because this was a time of great turmoil. Whenever we read these stories in the Bible, it's important to remember that the people at the time were living under foreign military occupation. Palestine was being ruled by the Roman Empire, and they were brutal about it. There were those that saw this as a good thing. There were those in Jerusalem, amongst their community, that were on Rome's side. There were those who were enriching themselves off the occupation. It was well known that there was some corruption that was happening in the temple. And they also knew that there were those amongst the population those who were telling themselves that Rome was actually on everybody's side, that Rome was bringing good order, that this was a law and order leadership, which of course has always been a euphemism for consolidating all the crime into the hands of those in power. There were those who were thrilled that Rome had brought in this time called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This was a time of a couple of 100 years of relative calm and no obvious wars, not because people were living with justice and goodwill, but because Rome had wiped out, destroyed, obliterated every other enemy that could be conceived. And if there was anybody else that thought they might raise a fuss, Rome had terrorized them into submission. That's why there was peace. There was just no one left to make a fuss. And Rome knew who these folks were that were on their side. They had an inventory. They knew who they could count on to make sure that they kept an eye on everything that was happening. And because of that, they also had an inventory of those who were the rabble-rousers. They had an inventory of everybody who was going to make a fuss, who was going to cause problems, and that was really important during this weekend because this is Passover. Jesus is going to Jerusalem for the yearly festival, which he has probably done every year of his life. This is a joyous celebration. There are parties and singing, and it's wonderful. But underneath it all, there is also a hint of tension. Do you remember when the first Passover was? The first Passover was when the Hebrew people were still living in slavery, and God was about to inflict his final and worst plague on the Egyptian people. The death of the firstborn of every family. This is the final way that God was going to force the freedom of his people out of slavery. Throw off the oppressors. Well, how do you think that's going to sound to those who are occupying these people now? How is Rome going to think about this festival where the Jewish people are throwing off the chains of their oppressors with great violence and force? Rome notices the connection. They know the stories. They know what this festival is all about. And so they also know that they need to be there in force as a preemptive stand against anybody else who thinks that Passover may be a rallying cry for rebellion. A call to bring about a new Passover where they throw off the chains of Rome in the same way they threw off the chains of slavery in Egypt. And this is what Jesus is riding into. This is sort of the lion's den. This is a dangerous time to be a preacher. And so Rome knows. They've been watching for Jesus. They know he's coming because they've heard about him. They've heard that he is one that is gathering a number of followers, and so they're on the lookout. Are they worried? Are they scared of Jesus and his followers? Probably not. This is the most impressive, most dangerous military the world had ever known. And so being a good preacher and teacher and miracle worker does not mean that you're going to be a good military leader. And no matter how many followers Jesus has managed to gather, even if they've managed to find some rudimentary weapons, they are no match for Rome. Just a few centurions would be able to quash any trouble that Jesus and his followers were causing. But then they start riding up. In Matthew's version, we hear that Jesus is riding 2 donkeys at the same time. Pretty hard to be dignified trying to ride 2 donkeys. Pretty awkward, really. Nobody's going to quake in fear at the idea of riding 2 donkeys. Real force would ride a war horse. And then there's the followers. Oh my goodness. Where did Jesus come up with these people? Because these are not dignitaries, these are not important people. To most people, these would be seen as the dregs. There's the criminals, there's the prostitutes, there's the uneducated shepherds and fisher people, there's the people that Jesus healed, those who used to be blind or have skin diseases. Why on earth would they be threatening? Maybe as Jesus and his procession started coming towards the temple, Rome thought, this is what we've been worried about? These people? What threat could these people ever have to the might of the Roman Empire? We don't have to worry about protests from these folks. But the thing is, they should have been worried. Because things were about to change. What we often don't catch in the way our 3-year cycle of readings falls into place is the rest of this story. From here, we hear these stories, and then we jump right on over to Jesus' arrest. But there's a whole lot in between. Sometimes we hear about what happens next. Jesus and his followers march right into the gates, through the city, up to the Temple Mount, and there Jesus cleanses the temple, overturns the tables of those taking advantage of people's religious beliefs to sell them gewgaws and trinkets, to take their money to filter off to Rome. Jesus overturns the tables of those who are taking the currency of the Jewish people and trading it in for Roman currency that says that Caesar is God. But he doesn't stop there. Jesus and his followers, according to Matthew, now stick around in the temple for a couple of days. They are disrupting, they are protesting, they are calling out the hypocrisy and the corruption of the leadership, basically just disrupting everything, making disorder out of the order that Rome so desperately tries to maintain. Now, could Rome put a stop to this? Absolutely they could. They could go in, drive them all out, put them all to the sword, but they also know that that would be very, very messy. To kill Jesus is to turn him into a martyr. To spill blood in the temple would be to break the illusion. To remove the plausible deniability that so many held, that saying that, oh, Rome is just here for our prosperity. Rome is here for good order. Rome is here to help us all. That would all be lost if they got rid of these peaceful protesters. And so Rome has to bide their time. This is not yet the time to act. Now, I would love to say at this point that all of the people, from the leadership all the way down to the shepherds, all heard Jesus' words of protest, of teaching, and they all heard the sense in it, and that everybody lived happily ever after. But we know that's not how the story goes. We know that in a few days, Jesus is going to be arrested and then crucified. Now, then, of course, after that, the followers do have the experience of Jesus still with them, and they are enlivened, and they are bolstered, and they go on to carry out bringing the gospel to every person they can reach. But then a few hundred years later, these same followers trade in their risk and their hard work and their persecution for a place of power and prestige within the very empire that killed the one they profess to follow. when Constantine offered a place in the Roman Empire for all Christians. Now, there were still those who were working very, very hard to share the authentic gospel, to share justice and peace for all people, but that was so hard while the empire was taking control. But we have made progress, haven't we? Peace has spread. Justice has increased. Rights have been given to those who never thought they would have rights again. But it's still so hard. The story has not ended. There are still tyrants to tear down from their thrones. There is still justice to be sought. There are still rights to be fought for. And sometimes it feels like it's just too much. Sometimes it feels that even though we've come so far, there is still so far to go to bring about the realm of God that Jesus promised. It just seems so difficult sometimes. But maybe those are those times when we just need to stop and breathe. Just take a deep breath and remind ourselves that we are not alone. We breathe God's breath. We breathe the same breath that so many others breathe with us. The community of gathered Jesus followers. We breathe the breath that reminds us that as long as we breathe, we have another moment to seek justice. As long as we breathe, we have another moment to speak the gospel truth that all people are loved by God. As long as we breathe, we can be reminded that we are God's people, called and empowered to bring God's love to the world. As long as we breathe, we can create and we can seek out beauty. Beauty in God's world, beauty in community. As long as we breathe, we can also sing. Sing beauty, sing creativity, sing glorious anthems, praising God, giving us hope, giving us a vision of the future.